Okay. Of course, we have Rosh Chodesh coming up tomorrow, Rosh Chodesh Av, and this very difficult time for all of Klal Yisrael. You have to have special schusim, special kavanas, and our learning, our davening, everything should be just raised a notch, if nothing else, to appreciate the moment, and of course the sakana that Klal Yisrael is in, for which we're being threatened again and again. Should the Rosh Chodesh and the Yom Tov, Tisha B'av is really a Chag, so there's this whole period leading up to the Chag, to the of Tisha B'av. The Rebbeinu Shalom should give us extra protection and the Yeshuas for Klal Yisrael. So may our learning reflect that. All right. So we are on Nun Daled Amud Aleph. We're continuing our discussion on whether a chomesh. We know that when you redeem, whether it's Kodesh or Maser or Truma, any of these substance, whatever it happens to be, you have to add, if you're redeeming it yourself, then you have to add a chomesh, 1/5, the Torah tells us, to the redemption. The question became whether the chomesh itself was Kodesh. In other words, okay, I'm adding a chomesh, I understand, but the chomesh is a chomesh. I mean, is it identical to what I'm redeeming or not? So we had this discussion last week in quite detail, and ultimately Rava came out and he said from the pasuk olav, because it says Yosef olav chomesh, the word olav is l'rabosh chomsho kamoso, that the chomesh has to be like what you are redeeming. And of course, if you're redeeming Maser Sheni, then it has to be like the Maser Sheni. In other words, just like the Maser Sheni has to be the produce that you can bring to the base, or money, actually, you bring to the base of Mikdash by produce. The same with chomesh. But for instance, in the case of kachim, where you're redeeming something holy, then the question becomes, and we'll see in a further discussion, does it actually have to be holy as well, or can it be money? Just like in any other case where you add a 5th, then it can be money or not. But from a love, we see that it has to be like kind to what you are redeeming. So that's the how Rava came out. Now the Gemara, we're going to go on Amar Ravina. We're going to actually bring a proof to that from a Mishnah. Okay, the Torah says it. So in other words, we're extrapolating from the words of the Torah, but here is proof positive from a Mishnah. So Amar Ravina, we're about let's see where we are. Better than 2/3 down. We're near the bottom.
Yeah, I have a Amar Ravina, third line from the bottom. Is that the one?
Third line from the bottom, right? Okay. So Amar Ravina, third line from the bottom. Amar Ravina. So Ravina says, Af ana nami tanina. We learned in a Mishnah this same thing that where Rava is telling us is from the pasuk. What does the Mishnah tell us? The Mishnah tells us hagonef truma v'lo achla. So if a person steals truma and he doesn't eat it, okay, he's stolen it, and then he has charata, and he says, no, this is truma, I can't do anything with it. Then mishalom tashlume kefel demei truma. Then he has to return the truma. He has to pay kefel. Now, interestingly, kefel in the case of truma, as we know, truma is a limited edition food because only a kohen can eat it. So if it comes into someone else's hands, they can't even use it. So therefore, it has a diminished value. So the Gemara means to tell us that you don't necessarily pay market value for the food, but you pay the value that it would receive on the market because it's truma. So if, let's say it was $100 worth of truma that he stole, so normally kefel would be $200. But because truma can only be eaten by a kohen, so maybe it's only worth $85, right? When they sell aliyahs, you can sell all the aliyahs, but when it comes to a kohen, you have a limited audience, so you can't necessarily go wild with the auction because only a kohen can buy it, and if a kohen isn't going to pay, then you're stuck. So that's pshat and truma, is that it's only what it could be valued for a Kohen. But nevertheless, that's an interesting side, but nevertheless, he has to pay kefel if he doesn't eat it. Ochla, if he inadvertently, we're not talking about someone intentionally eats, then there's a different Indian. But if he eats it inadvertently, he didn't know, he stole it and didn't know it was truma. Then says the Mishnah, Mishalem, he pays Shnei Kronim, V'chomesh. Now he has to pay 2 times the value, the same thing, and in terms of whatever the value is, but he has to add a chomesh. That's the chiddush. So if he has to add a chomesh, then you're going to wonder, what does he do for that chomesh? So says the Mishnah, Keren b'chomesh min hachulin. The actual principle and the chomesh, which we're now saying has to be like kind, has to be from chulin. Why from chulin? Because then you can make it, you bring it to the Kohen and it becomes truma, right? So it has to be like kind to what you were going to give to the Kohen. And that's the case also for the chomesh. Keren demei truma. And the other keren, in other words, that you can do with money. So interestingly, since you have to pay kefel and a chomesh, the Mishnah makes clear the keren, the penalty kofel that you're doing, that can be money. The underlying return has to be unconsecrated food like truma, and the chomesh has to be like the truma. So that's proof positive that the Beferish Mishnah, that when the Torah says alav means that it has to be like kind to the actual truma that you're taking. So if it's unconsecrated food, then that's what you have to give back. But the kefel, the double, that can be money. That doesn't have to be unconsecrated food, because that's no longer going to be given to the Kohen. It's not kodesh. That's just a penalty. So we see a distinction, but we see also proof that the chomesh has to be like the truma, in this case, unconsecrated food.
So the chomesh then goes to the base of Mikdash.
Well, the chomesh, yeah, the chomesh. Well, in
yeah.
this case, the chomesh actually would go to the Kohen. It would go to the Kohen because it's unconsecrated. Just like the food that you're giving to the unconsecrated food goes to the Kohen, the chomesh as well, because it has. It's a davar shabbat. Yeah, it's a davar shabbat kedusha. You can't eat it. You can't eat it.
So only the Kohen, but it's not converted to truma. It's just that he's the only one that can eat it.
That's correct. It's not truma, but he's the only one who could use it. That's correct.
So it's equivalent to truma.
It's equivalent to truma, exactly. And that we learned from Olav, because Olav says that it has to be like kind. And like kind in this case would be truma. So it's a very interesting step that we're taking, and we're saying that we're confirming that chomesh is like kind, and we're seeing that in a case where there was a geneva of truma, then the chomesh has to be like the truma, but the kefel doesn't have to be like the truma. The kefel doesn't have to be in chulin; it can be in money. So that's what we're coming to tell us. Okay. So Rashi there on the bottom, Demei Truma, Kama Shu Shava Lamecha Beshuk, V'dame Psuchim, Demei Pechusin, Medame Chulin, She'en Roy El Kohanim, and it's devalued. Pechusim, it's devalued because it's only roy for the Kohanim. Ve'en Roy B'mei Tumasoi, Ve'im Mitame Osra Be'achila. And if it's metame, it's also bechil lefichach damya muatim. Therefore, again, another reason why it's devalued. The hainitakama demei truma. That's why it says demei truma, specifically to say that whatever the value of truma is, not just the value on the open market, but the value of truma, which in this case, because it's only for a kohen, would be lower than, let's say, it's this food's market value would be higher if it was not truma.
Okay. Rabbi, can I ask a question?
Yeah, Michael.
I understand. So you have to revert back to giving unconsecrated food.
Right.
So, but you're saying that the value of the truma is reduced because of the limitation. Does that mean that you're giving less unconsecrated food value than you did before?
No, the underlying truma has to be identical. The kefel, the extra, the doubling, because we have to pay kefel because you stole it, right? So
Right.
the money for that kefel does not have to be market value. It can be a reduced value because truma is a limited edition food that not everybody can
But it's
do.
double the value of the original, isn't it? Based
Correct.
on the double of the original. So it's
Correct.
Well, no,
I'm sorry, go
Yeah,
ahead.
go ahead.
well, I was gonna say, so it sounds like what we're saying is, let's say it was $100 worth of grain on the open market, but as truma, it's worth. If you had a market of just truma, the Kohanim trading amongst themselves, it would only be worth $80 because they're all overloaded with truma grain this year. So then he would have to pay if the total, including a penalty, would be effectively 180.
Right.
But
Right.
that's not double.
No, that's the point. Is that in other words that the original
for
is the
truma is
original
different, yeah.
amount, but that the kfil, this penalty
Right.
that would normally be a doubling, would only be the increase based on the direct market, the market value of that particular item, not the market value of that item in general.
So it's no longer double the original value. It's double what it would be if it was truma. So that's the second amount. And what about the chomesh? Is that based on the base value or the adjusted truma value?
No, that's based on the original value, because the chomish is tied to the truma, not to the kefil.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you. Thank
Right. So it's a little bit of a twist, but nevertheless, this is the and we're saying that, look, he meant to steal it, but he didn't know it was truma. In other words, he knew it was a Geneva is one thing, eating truma is something else, So so we punish him for the Geneva, but in the case of truma, because he wasn't going to eat it, therefore we're saying that he could do that in money, and he doesn't have to do it in truma. Anyway,
Well, he wasn't going to eat it. Why would this? Somebody's stealing this stuff. Why would they even care about truma? They're stealing whatever they can get their hands on. They're going to steal it and then say, "Oh, this is kodesh. I can't eat it."
well, in other words, yes. In the first case of the Gemara, where the Gemara says lo achla, and he didn't eat it because maybe after he stole it, he went out and he realized, oh my gosh, I've just stolen truma. In other words, yes, he would want to steal, but he wouldn't go so far as to say, I'm going to steal truma. But so therefore, because he didn't eat it, therefore, then he just has to pay kefil, right? Basic kefil. Only when he eats it does the chomish come into effect. Because even though he was inadvertent, we're not saying he did it intentionally, but inadvertently he ate it, then we fine him the chomish. Kefil he has to pay anyway, but then we fine him the chomish. If he didn't eat it, then there's no chomish. There's no chomish.
All right, so this reminds me of a story I heard a few years ago about some rabbi. I seen rabbi, but whatever. It was some famous rabbi, and who, in order to show just how special Jews are, he goes around and he poses as a black market dealer, and he shows that some of the people, the Jews, they'll if you offer a Jew to buy in a place where it's forbidden, black market taxed, whatever, cigarettes or alcohol or all kinds of other things, they'll be be like, oh yeah, I'll get a deal and whatever, I don't care about the government. But if you offer them a deal on chametz on Pesach, nobody would take it, because that's what Jews are, because we respect the laws of Hashem much more than the laws of a corrupt country, etc. Fine. But here, the two laws, Geneva and Kedusha of Truma, are the same. These are both halachas, and in fact, the penalty is all based on halacha and so on. They're all halachas from Hashem. So why are we saying that they would follow one, but they wouldn't follow the other? just doesn't make sense to me.
When you say follow one, what do you mean by follow
You have
one?
a thief, a ganav.
Yeah.
He's stealing stuff, even though he knows, and in the end he gets caught. He actually has to pay kafel, etc., because the Torah says you can't steal, and here's the penalty. And yet we're saying that he would be principled enough to, wait a minute, it's truma. I can't eat that, even though I stole it. It just doesn't add up to me.
Right. Oh, well, okay. So you're saying that that how would that come to be? I get it. Okay. So you can ask that question, but the Mishnah is trying to delineate for us or hypothecate a case where someone did steal it and he was destitute. Okay. He needed the food, whatever, but conscientiously, he said, "Look, okay, I'm not the greatest person. I'm a ganav, but to eat truma, I mean, sometimes that sort of all of a sudden gives you an insight that he has a hero tshuva. No, I can't do that. I can't go so far as to eat truma. I mean, look, psychologically, you're right. If a guy is poor, doesn't have food, he's going to eat. He's going to eat. All right, he's going to eat. And we see here the second part of the Mishnah tells us that if, in fact, he stole and he was hungry and he ate and he didn't realize that what he stole was truma, he stole chulin, he stole regular chulin, then we add on the chomesh as a penalty for eating truma inadvertently. So in other words, that chomesh applies because he was b'shogeg. Yes, he was a ganav, but he didn't mean to eat truma, and he inadvertently ate truma. So that chomesh kicks in, and he has to pay the chomesh. And the Mishnah tells us the chomesh is like kind to the actual truma because that's what he stole. So, I mean, yours is a moral question, but in terms of the practicality, the Mishnah just wants to show us how the steps are taken and deliver the proof that the chomesh does get raised to the level of kodesh of the truma, and ultimately has to be like kind. So
I guess it's sort of like getting a gangster in the secular world, getting a gangster on tax evasion, even though they did things that we don't normally
right,
smart work.
He backed into the crime. You're right. Okay,
Rabbi, can I just clarify again? Just another point.
Yeah.
So the kafel can
applies
be,
only to the geneva.
I understand that, but the kafel can be in any form the value of what the truma would be. In other words, it could be kesef, it could be truma, it could be unconsecrated, as long as it equates to that value. The kafel can be any
Correct.
form.
Right.
The truma itself, the chomesh, is
that can't be money. The point is that chomesh can't be money. It has to be unconsecrated food, like the truma was unconsecrated.
Unconsecrated food at the value of the original value of what he did.
Correct.
But can he give unconsecrated food as kafel?
He can, but the chiddush is he doesn't have to. He can. You're right. He can, but the chiddush is he doesn't have to. He can substitute money.
But the chomesh has to be in the form that
of unconsecrated food.
I just want to add one thing to what Menashe says, because I have the same issue. The person who stole it, who they stole it from, was a Kohen who was poor.
No, he stole it from the owner.
The owner had separated out truma, was going to give it to a Kohen, but didn't give it yet.
So the owner, you're right. I'm sorry. The owner was poor, and he took it for himself and he ate it. But then then he was going to eat it, but then he decided it was truma, so it's not so bad. But he stole it from someone who doesn't have the money, to fend for themselves, and that's because it's kodesh. It's on a higher term than sustenance for somebody else. I'm sorry.
Right.
It just doesn't seem logical, because the Kohen might have more, even though it's kodesh. I understand that higher level, but you're doing damage to someone who is being hurt by it. It just doesn't seem that it should cancel the other.
But if he had to go to the farm to steal, First of all, he had to know that that part of the farm was designated for Truma. Otherwise,
He wouldn't necessarily know, Jay,
I
which
know, but
portion
that's
was
what,
dedicated. He wouldn't
that's
know.
why I'm asking. How does he know it would have been Truma?
He doesn't know. The point is that he may have done unwittingly, thinking, "Oh, I'm just stealing from Reuven, who happens to own a field, and I'm taking some of his food." He didn't
Right.
know that that food was already dedicated to the Kohen, but not yet given. So he doesn't know that.
It wasn't even taken off the field.
It wasn't taken off the field, but the owner already dedicated that amount of truma. So in theory, it was already kodesh, even though it wasn't yet given to the Kohen. So when he's taking it inadvertently,
That's a hard one.
Yeah, he happened to pick the wrong
Because
food.
any part of the field could have been one that the
You're right.
owner,
Right, but he happened to have taken the portion that the owner already dedicated to the Kohen as truma.
shouldn't that have in those days? Shouldn't they have marked off part of their field?
Yeah, I don't know how they did that.
No, but this is once you don't do the truma when it's still in the field. You cut it down, you harvest it, and then you divide it up, right?
But it's dedicated while it's still growing.
Well,
no,
I mean,
I don't think
owner
so.
Look, Menashe and everybody.
I could be wrong, but I
could well have said this corner here, this piece. It's a beautiful piece. I want to give it to the Kohen. It's ripe. It's sweet. Whatever. I mean, and he could have said, "This is what I want to give to the Kohen." You're right. Normally, you just cut and you say, "This is the Kohen's portion." But if he already designated a specific thing for the Kohen without yet having harvested it or without having it separated from everything else, then the person who stole it, he didn't know it was truma. He just thought it was part of the whole field and he was going to take a piece for himself. Turns out it was truma. It was already dedicated, so it was truma. And so for that, he said, if it was truma, I never would have stolen it. It's one thing to steal chulin, another thing to steal truma. So he was a righteous ganef, but at the same time, so again, the facts are what they are. It's what we want to get out of this Mishnah is the impact of how we treat different parts of that produce. The underlying produce is truma. The kefel that he has to pay is not truma, can be money, and the chomesh has to be like kind to the truma. That's how we want to, separate out the three boxes, and this way we can say that it's a raya. I mean, the Torah says it, of course, but the Mishnah articulates it in particular words, that's what the Torah means when it says a love. It has to be like kind to the thing. All right, let's just finish the Rashi because there's an interesting Gemara right after this. Shnei Koronim, he pays 2 times the Keren, right? Echad lekeren, ve'echad lekefel, v'chomish b'shvil achilasa. So the chomish is specifically because he ate it. Min achulin, peiros. So Peres Misukanin. In other words, the Peres have to be Misukin to be just from Chulin. V'hakeren hasheni shu bo machmas kefel shel knas geneva mishalem nami demei truma. He pays the value of the truma kolomer. What we mean to say is moos, money, right? He pays money for the value of the truma. Kishemecheres truma b'shuk. So in other words, how much do you pay? If you took truma in the marketplace, like I said, who's going to bid on truma? Only a Kohen. So a Kohen is not going to pay you a full value. It's like an auction. He'll say, all right, I'll pay 80%, 70%, whatever it is. And that's whatever the truma, the Kohen would have bid for that truma, that's what you pay in kefel, in money. All right. So that's how the Gemara resolves it. Now on Nun Dalet Amid Beis on the top, Shema Mina, Chumsha Kamoso Shema Mina. All right, so now we have the Gemara ends and says, okay, now we have a proof positive that the Chomesh is exactly like the Truma, and that's what we learned. Okay, now the Gemara, again, we're still honing in on this Chomesh because it presents all kinds of fascinating facets of it. So the Gemara goes on further. Omar Rava. Rava says, Gabe Gezel Ksiv, regarding Gezel, we learn in the Torah, what does the Torah say? Stamazoi by Gezel with regard to Truma. It says v'chamishisav Yosef olav. Now here we're going to be very, very medactic, very exact in the words of the Torah, because one letter from word to word makes a very big difference. What does the Torah say? V'chamishisav, and its fifth, Yosef olav. So, okay, I'm going to point something out because we're going to see it in a minute. V'chamishisav, its fifth, is different than v'chamishiso without the yud. And I'm pointing it out because we're going to now talk about that the words mean something different. When it says v'chamishisav Yosef alav, that he has to pay a fifth, right? He adds a fifth to the underlying principle, and that's what he has to pay, right? V'nishbalo ala chomesh. Now, what happens if he repays the what he stole, and then the fellow says, "Well, where's my chomesh?" And he says, "I paid you the chomesh. I gave you return. I gave it to you. I gave you the underlying amount, and I gave you the chomesh." He says, "No, you didn't." So he has to swear that he paid the chomesh, just like in any case of where we have a geneva. Then we say v'nishba, right? And you have to. The principle of swearing comes in, and many people don't want to swear. That's why they pay instead of swearing. But he swears. He says, "I just gave you the whole thing. I gave you 100% plus 5%,
But
plus 20%."
Isn't it all in front of you? You know whether it was 105% or not.
Right. Oh, okay. So he said, I put it into your Dropbox, and then I left. And the fellow said, "No, you didn't. All I see in my box is the principal. I don't see the chomesh." Yeah, you're right. If it's right in front of him, you can argue. But he's saying that he paid him, and then the fellow says, "Where is it?" And he says, "Take a look. It's where I left it." And he says, "No, you didn't." So the Torah says, "V'nishbalo ala chomesh." He can swear on the chomesh. Now, what happens if he swears falsely on the chomesh? What happens to that chomesh? Again, he gave him back the principal. Now we're dealing with the chomesh. There's an argument about whether or not he paid the chomesh. How do we deal with that argument? Says the Gemara. And then he confesses and he says, "No, you're right. I did not pay you, whether it meant intentionally or not intentionally. I swore falsely, and I fess up that I didn't pay." Says the Gemara, chomesh al chomesh. Now he has to pay a chomesh on the chomesh. So what are we talking about? So let's just say that he stole something for 5 zuz, right? Stole something for 5 zuz. He has to return the item, and he has to give him 5 plus 1. A fifth of 5 is 1, and he gives him 6. He has to give him 5. So he swore that he only gave him 5. He swore that I paid you everything. Then he confesses, so he has to pay him 1, and he has to pay a chomesh on the 1. On the 1 that he just gave, which is the chomesh, he has to pay 1. In other words, he has to pay the equivalent of 20% of 1 zuz, right? So the Gemara, it tells us a chiddush. Okay, so that's the fact. But the Gemara goes on to say, this can result in a payment of a chomesh less than the worth of a pruta, because let's say this situation goes on, and he swears falsely, and let's say it was less than 5 zuz. Let's say it was 4 zuz that he stole, right? So he has to give him 20% of 4 zuz, whatever that comes out to, and then the chomesh on top of that could wind up being less than a pruta. I mean, hypothetically, it could be less than a pruta. So you would think, okay, less than a pruta. We've talked until we're blue in the face about shava pruta. That if you don't have a shava pruta, then you can't really mitzamtzem. You can't convert. You can't collect. You can't put it together. But the Gemara tells us that yes, that when it comes to a chomesh, then yes, it can be less than a shava pruta. How you pay is a different question, but we're not going to nullify it because it's less than a shava pruta. That's how far we go with a chomesh. So
Rabbi, can I ask a question?
yeah,
Why isn't it an extra chomesh? It says a chomesh on the chomesh. Why can't it be interpreted as 1 plus 1? So it's 7 in your example.
because we're talking about not the reason why we have a chomesh is because he stole a principal, right? Because the principal was worth 5. The principal was repaid, no longer an issue. The only focus of our discussion is a chomesh. So you can't if you're going to penalize him and the penalty is a chomesh, it's not fair to say we're going to penalize him with another chomesh on the original principle, which
Why not? Because he didn't deliver what was required under halachic law.
Right.
So why not penalize him the same way as he was before and make him pay a whole other chomesh?
Because then you're going to over penalize him because you're going to say because you did something wrong with the chomesh, we're going to go back and penalize you on the underlying object which you repaid.
You stole and then you lied again, and now
But you lied on the chomesh. Now I understand the moral dilemma, but in specific fact, he only lied about the chomesh. So if you have to look at it sort of with narrow vision, we're going to say the only thing that's in play here is the chomesh, not the underlying. I mean, yes, he's a ganav, okay, but there has to be a sense of equity and fairness even to the ganav because he made his repayment. It's just the chomesh that he was denying. So now it's the chomesh that is the subject of the entire discussion. So we penalize him with a chomesh on a chomesh, and the Gemara tells us, in fact, that ad infinitum, that chomesh can be collected again and again and again in diminishing numbers. In diminishing numbers, if he persists and lies again or lies again, whatever the case may be. But we're only focusing on the chomesh. Not
chomesh is a separate item now. Forget about the field and everything else.
Right.
He owes a chomesh, and now the second lie comes in. It doesn't matter what happened earlier because
that's correct.
He paid back the first lie.
Right. So Michael, you're thinking of the morality of it, that it's all tied to the original theft, and therefore he's a ganef and we should punish him, and that's all fine and good because in theory he's doing something really not nice here.
But then he lied again.
He lied again. But
it's not so bad if you lie again. The point is that his debt at that point became the whole thing. If you don't meet your obligation, then you should have to pay the consequences again for not meeting your full obligation.
Right. So I understand your position, and the Gemara's position is that we can separate them out because one event is the underlying theft that he has taken care of. Now we're dealing with the chomesh, and the question of the chomesh has to be addressed separately. I understand your point, but the Gemara doesn't agree with that because it says he repaid his debt. Once he repaid his debt, you can no longer extract a second payment of the same principal. And if you lied on the chomesh, then it's the chomesh that we have to deal with.
Michael has a good question here. Why do you want to separate? The chomesh is part of the whole problem that he created for himself.
Correct.
And why should the Gemara want to separate and say, okay, you paid back the first theft, all right? But you're a ganef because you stole and you had to pay it back. Now we're going to talk about the rest. But if you take the whole thing as one big lie, when he stole right away, he owed the principal plus a chomesh as one unit, not separate units. That's what Michael is saying.
Right. Now,
why does the Gemara want to separate them?
Right. So that's a fair question. But if you remember a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about the originally talking about the chomesh, we asked the question whether the chomesh, remember, was part and parcel of the underlying
event
food, or whether it was a separate matter. And at the end, the maskana was that it is a separate matter. It's not the principal plus a fifth as one mass. It's two matters. And then we had to come onto the alav to tell us, but even though it's separate, it's separate but similar. So there's two steps here. The first question we asked is remember we asked the question, if a person didn't return the chomesh, you only return the original amount, can be deconsecrated? Can we eat it? At back and forth. Maskana, yes. We can separate the two out, and we can say that if he returned one and didn't get the chomesh, remember we talked about the gizber and hegdish, and in other words, we talked about all kinds of different ways where you can collect that chomesh later, so it's not attached to the actual principal food, and that can be taken care of, and the chomesh can come later. That's step one. Then the question became, okay, if it's now a separate matter, we've now determined that it's separate, Jay, not one and the same.
Right.
Then the question becomes, how do we treat that chomesh? So we came to a maskana today in the morning, the first part of our discussion, that chomesh has to be identical to what the underlying amount, separate but equal. That's the principle, separate but equal. In other words, it's not the principle. The principle you can have without the chomesh, but it has to be the same as the principle in terms of how you treat it. Now we come to a next step. The question is, if someone stole and now he returned. So we already know that if he returned the principle, he's fulfilled his obligation, he has to be careful, whatever it happens to be. The chomesh, that's separate. The chomesh is a separate issue. If he starts messing around with the chomesh and saying, I paid you and I swear this and that, the other, then the train has left the station on the principle. We already know that. We know that principle has already been taken care of. So even though morally, Michael, I understand your point, but the Gemara already established that the principle is already out there. It's gone. It's no longer part of the discussion. The discussion only is in the chomesh, and if he swore falsely and now he has to pay, then there is a knas, there is a penalty, and that penalty is another chomesh. But it can only be a chomesh on the chomesh because that's all we have in front of us. Yeah, Jay.
The thing here is also, when you steal the original, there's no timeline that says has to pay it back by within a day or a week or a month.
Right.
There's a delay on when you can pay back and get that off the table, which means that the chomesh itself is negotiable in terms of, I'll do it in 90 days. I don't need
right. So there's some flexibility on the chomesh, right?
If you lie about it and you never really pay back the chomesh, you now have a new set of lies.
That's correct.
You're guilty of not paying the chomesh.
Back the chomesh, and we have to deal with the
penalty for not paying the chomesh is the penalty for anything else that you owed back. You got to pay a fifth.
That's correct.
As a separate tax.
That's right.
Even if you borrowed a lawnmower from your neighbor and you didn't return it, you'd end up with the same story. You'd have to go buy a 1/5 more than what the lawnmower was worth. And if you don't pay that back, it's the same kind of case. They separate it as two separate cases.
Right. Exactly right. Exactly right.
Right, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, again, I understand the morality of it seems to be a little bit, questionable. But in terms of halacha, we have to go. Even the ganav has rights. Let's put it this way, Michael: a ganav has rights, even though he's a ganav.
Yeah, but so I understand the explanation. I accept the explanation. The point is that you're. I'll just say this one last time. You're adding that penalty to absolve yourself. You have to pay a chomesh. That's the penalty. It means that if you don't, at that point, if you don't provide a solution for the whole thing, it seems like you've perpetuated, and the punishment should be again on the whole thing because you shortchanged it, because that's why the penalty is imposed. If you can string this along, I mean, it's 5% on one. You can say, well, the market's gonna, there's gonna be a shortage in the market. I can make 10% on this, and it's not met the requirement of punishment because you violated the law. It just doesn't seem right to.
I understand. Believe me, I get your point. And as I say, on the moralities of it, I think you can make that argument and say, why should he escape? Because the whole thing originated with a bigger number, with a bigger amount. Why should he escape without having to pay based on that? But the halacha comes to tell us that even the Ganav, they say, even the Ganav has rights, that if he's taking care of part of his problem, then we can only focus on the rest of his problem. By the way, I misspoke when I said the Chomish is a fifth, not 5%. It's 20%. In other words, it's 20% of the principal, which is not insignificant, by the way. If you're talking about $100, a Chomish is $20. It's not just a throwaway. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. So now, if we're now arguing over the $20 and he has to pay a chomesh on the $20, then the question is, now we're starting to pay another. And again, we'll talk about. Remember, the halacha is. Remember, we a couple of weeks ago we had a discussion of whether or not the chomesh is milagav or lamakev. In other words, is it from inside or from outside? And we ultimately said that the fifth is from outside, not milagav. It is milabar, which means that he has to pay an amount which, when added to the principal, becomes a fifth. So it's not insignificant what he has to pay. He may have to shell out, $20 and then another $5. So we're penalizing him. And again, in those days, every dollar counted, every zuz counted. He's getting penalized for what he's doing. There's no question about it. But nevertheless, there's a fairness here that even the Ganef has to be treated fairly. Anyway, all right. So now we've established that, and we've taken it from one step to the next to the next. Now we understand exactly what the penalties are with a chomesh. Now the Gemara wants to transpose and talk about, okay, now that we understand all these halachas, how does it apply to truma? Okay, so here we have a Kohen who was supposed to get a truma, and now there's all these irregularities, and there's a chomesh. So now let's take a look, because we're going to see a very interesting pattern now, which will start today about truma, and then we're going to talk about Masa Sheni, and then we're going to talk about hektish. There's three categories that we talk about when we talk about a chomesh. And remember, and they're all kodesh to a certain degree. Truma, Masa Sheni, which is kodesh to you, and then there's hektish to the Beis Hamikdash. So, but they're all different. One is to the Kohen, one is to you, one is to the Beis Hamikdash. So here's what the Gemara says: Gabi truma ksiv, and that's why I pointed out the pasuk Chamishisav Yosef Olav, because we have to be very exact on. There's a different language for different categories. Okay, Gabi truma ksiv, by truma, what does the Torah tells us? The Torah tells us, "Ki yochel kodesh bishgaga." If he ate, meaning the ganef, if he ate kodesh bishgaga by mistake, in other words, he stole it, no question, but he didn't realize it was truma, so he ate it b'shogeg. Says the pasuk, "V'yosef chamishi so olav," and he adds a fifth to it, right? He adds a fifth to it, chamishi so, right? Just above, okay? And he adds a fifth, and with that fifth, he has now paid off his debt to the Kohen. And okay, so he pays the fifth. Now, the chamishi so is b'lashon yochid. It's a lashon of yochid, not a lashon of rabbin. Now, utanan. And we learned in the Mishnah, okay, the Mishnah in Truma says as follows: Ochel Truma b'shogeg. This is from the Mishnah. If someone ate Truma b'shogeg, Mishalim Keren v'chomesh. In other words, no gezel. A person ate Truma b'shogeg. He didn't know it was Truma. He has to repay it, and he has to give a chomesh. Echad ochel, echad shose, v'echad hasech. And the Mishnah goes on to say specifically that when it says that he ate truma, it also includes drinking, echila, shtia, and sicha. In other words, if he used the truma, it's kind of like a lotion. Maybe it was something that you can make from the kernels, or something you can make a lotion, or some kind of oil. Maybe it was oil, an oil type of thing. Those three categories are considered a chila, and if he uses those three categories, he has to pay a chomesh, right? Okay. Again, this is coming to exclude if he uses the truma not in achila shtia and shasiya. Not relevant to us, but just to make a point that if someone takes truma and destroys it or does something with it that isn't achila, shtia, or sicha, this doesn't apply. The chomesh doesn't apply. It only applies to this category of achila, shtia, and sicha. Then the Mishnah goes on to say, echad truma tahora, ve'echad truma tameya. That's a chiddush. Not only does it apply to truma tahora, but what happens if this truma was cut? It was metaltalin. He cut it, and then an animal, a sheretz, fell on it. It's no longer kodesh. Still, he has to pay a chomesh. That's how far the penalty goes. Is that even if it's tomei, he still has to pay a chomesh. That's a chiddush, right? And now here's the punchline of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, okay, now what happens in the case of, let's say he's stealing, denying everything we've been talking about? Mishalem chumsha v'chumsha de chumsha. He has to pay a fifth, we know, and depending on the circumstance, he has to pay a chomesh on the chomesh. So in the case of truma, this Mishnah says beferish that the principle of chomesh, the principle of multiple chomesh, applies to truma. Says it very straightforwardly in the Mishnah. Okay, so what we've been talking about when we talk about, if in the case of gezel or other circumstance, you have to pay a chomesh and a chomesh. All right, so let's take a look. Rashi tells us. Okay. Oh, the shmamina we said before. The mashma peres v'lo mos, has to be peres, not money. Gabe gezel ksiv, gabe oshem gezelos, because when you steal it, you besides repay, you also have to bring a carbon oshem. So gabe oshem gezelos, where you in the case of oshem gezelos ksiv im gezel, if he steals v'chopar and he denies v'nishba l'shaker chamishisav. Chamishis harbe. You have to pay multiple fifths because, and this is our case before that we talked about, because you're now being punished on the chomesh. It's nami the minyan de ikatuva, and we learned in the Mishnah specifically that number is great, meaning that chomesh on top of a chomesh on top of a chomesh. Technically ad infinitum, but we're talking about where you have to pay potentially multiple fifths. All right, so that's the halacha by truma. Now, what's the halacha by maser sheni? Because we've been talking about maser sheni all this time. The ilugabe maser, but by maser he means maser sheni. Lo michtav ksiv, v'lo milsatana. By Maser Sheni, there was never a discussion, not in the Torah, not in the Mishnah, not in any halacha, as to about a chomesh and a chomesh, right? We never asked the question about a fifth. So l'chayra, by Maser Sheni, a chomesh and a chomesh doesn't exist, because by truma, we had all this discussion in the Mishnah, and we fleshed it out to say that there is such a thing as chomesh and a chomesh. The Mishnah tells us that. By Maser Sheni, total silence, no discussion about a chomesh and a chomesh. So we can at least accept, for this purpose, for our discussion, that Maser Sheni, there's no such thing. In other words, if someone stole Maser Sheni, which has, you have to pay kefil, let's say, but you don't have to pay a chomesh, because there's no chomesh attached to it. In other words, the kedusha of Maser Sheni does not equate to the kedusha of truma. That much I think we can say at this point in time.
But Rabbi, if it was the other way around, if the pasuk was on Maser Sheni, we could make the interpretation.
We could make that right. But since that pasuk was only on truma, I take it back. It was on truma and it was on Hegdish, on Kodesh, but not on Maser Sheni. So Maser Sheni, which is, we're trying to compare everything. What is Maser Sheni like? We have to say that Maser Sheni is not like Truma, because there was no mention. And again, the Torah is exact. If the Torah says by Truma, this whole inyan, Hamishi Alav, that's what we have to accept. Torah doesn't say that by Maser Sheni, so there's no way of extrapolating, oh, we're going to equate it to Truma, we're going to say it's like Truma. It's not like Truma. Maser Sheni is separate. Remember, Maser Sheni is a Kedusha only for you, because you have a Chiyuv of Maser Sheni, whereas Truma is sort of a Truma and Kodesh, Hegdish for the Beis HaMikdash have a higher ceiling, if you will. It's a bigger,
Why shouldn't
it's a higher degree.
why shouldn't there be a penalty for stealing Maser?
You might think, you see, this is an interesting point. You might think that for Maser Sheni, which again, you can't eat Maser Sheni, only the Balabos can eat Maser Sheni. So why not institute a penalty? That's the Chiddush. The Chiddush is that it doesn't rise to the level where if you did something improper, that you have to pay. Now, the owner has to pay a chamishis when he redeems his own. That we know. But beyond that chomesh, there is no longer a chomesh and a chomesh the way there is on the other. Okay. Now, so now we go to the third category.
The reason is only because the Torah didn't allude to it or say
That's right.
something.
Right. The Torah did not. If the Torah would have wanted, it would have said with specificity by Maser Sheni the word chamishis or chamishis is Allah. We would have made a drasha just like we make in Truma and Hagdish. We would have made the same drasha, but it doesn't say it, so we can't make the drasha. We can't make it up. We can't say, oh, it's similar enough; it should be the same. No, that we can't say. Now we come
there
to
was no Torah Shabbat Peh that came along about this question.
Yeah, but the rabbis didn't really find it necessary to create a siyag or any kind of larger, a penalty on Maser Sheni than what the Torah already said. So again, it's Chazal. I mean, if they had done it, we would have argued, yes, they did it as a siyag, so it should be comparable to Truma. That's what we would have said, right? Yeah. If they had done it. But obviously, the Chazal did not feel that with Maser Sheni, they had to have the same degree of penalty as they do with Truma. Now we come to the third category, Gabe Hegdish. So what's the story about you want to bring something to the Beis HaMikdash? Gabe Hegdish Ksiv, by Hegdish it says, now look at the language, look at the difference in the language. By Hegdish it says, B'ma Magdish Yigal as Beso, okay, if he wants to redeem the Kodesh as Beso, but Yosef Chamishis Kesef Erkacha. Then he has to redeem. So once he redeems, he adds a fifth of the valuation of the underlying Kodesh. So if it was $100, then he has to add 20, right? But look at the language. It says the Yosef Chamishis. By Truma it says the Yosef Chamishiso, right? Which we said before. And here the language is slightly different. It's Chamishis. Okay, very subtle, but let's see what that subtlety tells us. Utanan, okay, and having seen that subtlety, the Mishnah says, and this, by the way, is our Mishnah, which we're going to learn in a couple of weeks, a little bit later on here in Bava Metzia. What does the Mishnah there say? The Mishnah says, "Hapodeh as hekdisho." If someone redeems his hegdish, something that he dedicated to the Beis HaMikdash, and he wants to bring it up to Yerushalayim, and he can't bring it up, so he has to redeem it and take the money. Mosef Chomesh, then he has to add a fifth, right? He adds a fifth. Chamish, so Chumsha Tanan, right? Chumsha the Chumsha Lo Tanan.
This is not a punishment. The fifth, it's not a tax. It's not anything.
That's right. No, but if you redeem your own, anytime you redeem your own, like we saw by Maser Sheni, even once you redeem your own, you have to add that fifth. It's not a penalty. It's a way of, in other words, you're mechoyev to bring it, so we're giving you the opportunity to do it. But in order to redeem it, we ask a little bit more from you. Not a penalty, but we ask a little bit more from you. So Hapodes HaKodesh, Mosef Chomesh, he has to add the fifth. So it says Chumsha, a fifth, Chumsha de Chumsha Lo Tanan. It doesn't mention Chumsha de Chumsha. Frek the Gemara Mai. So now we know what it is by Truma. We know what it is by Maser Sheni. What is it by Kodesh? Is it like Masasheni, where it's a fifth, no more? Or is it like Truma, where you can go to a fifth and a fifth and a fifth? You can go down the road. So that's the Gemara's kasha. In other words, how do we evaluate Bedek Habayis, Kodesh, as compared to the two other categories that we talk about in the Gemara, Truma and Masasheni? So that's the Gemara's kasha. And that's how do we deal with it, right? Says the Gemara, okay, so now we're gonna go into the actual lashon, and you see how the Gemara in its wisdom, it parses every word and every letter. Every letter in the Torah has a meaning. And this, when we talk about there's no extra letter, there's no extra word. Okay, so we say it in a general sense. We say the Torah is as brief as possible. By learning this Gemara, you're going to see not only is the Gemara as brief as possible, but how Chazal take the brevity and then parse the words of the abbreviated word and come up with it. It's a brilliant thought. So take a look. Okay, Gambi Truma Ksiv. By Truma, it says V'Yosaf, right? V'Yosaf Chamishiso, that you will add a fifth. Gabi Kodesh Nami Ksiv V'Yosaf. So we're trying to understand, is Kodesh like Masasheni or is Kodesh like Truma? So first the Gemara says, you know what? I'm going to show you, L'chaira, it's like Truma. Why? Because by Truma it says V'Yosaf, that you will add, and by Kodesh it also says V'Yosaf, that you will add, right? So the Chayra, just like by Truma, you can add a fifth of a fifth, so too, by Kodesh, you add a fifth of a fifth. In other words, if I say to you, how do we look at Truma? And you say, you know what? The word there is a word in Truma which is similar to the word in Hegdish. We're going to hang our hat on that. The fact that V'Yosaf works for one, V'Yosaf should work to the other. So because by Truma it says V'Yosaf, and by Hegdish it says V'Yosaf, the Gemara wants to extrapolate. That means that Hegdish is like Truma, and you can collect Chomesh on Chomesh. You see how the thinking works. Just because of that one word, we're going to say it's a Gzera Shava, and it's equivalent, and we're going to be able to say that you can do it. That's one way of looking at the story. Oh, Dilma, no. Well, there's another way of looking at the story. Why? Because we're going to say Gabe Truma V'Ksiv V'Yosaf, right? By Truma, it says V'Yosaf, that he will add, right? That we say Ishokalta le levav de V'Yosaf. Rashi will explain this, but we take the vav of V'Yosaf. Again, look how we're parsing the letters. We're going to take the vav of V'Yosaf, and he will add V'Shodisale al Chamishi so, and we're going to take that vav and attach it to the chamishis, to the word a fifth, and make it chamishi so, right? Havalei chamishi sov. Then it becomes not chamishi so, but chamishi sov with two vavs. You can't have a word ending in two vavs. Therefore, that's how you derive chomesh al gabe chomesh, because you have the word chamishi sov. Do you see what he's doing? You have the word v'yosaf. Okay, so you know what? Because by Truma it says V'Yosaf, so if you take it says Yosef Alav, you add on it. What's Pshat V'Yosef Alav? And you add to it. What does the V come to tell us? It's an extra letter, and the Torah doesn't have extra letters. So we want to darshan that Vav of V'Yosef comes really to mean. And there's a principle in the Gemara, which Rashi will explain in a minute, and it's called Gorin Umosvin U'V'Darshan. Rashi will explain that in a minute. That sometimes you can Goreya, you can take from one, Mosif added to another, and then Darshan what that event means. So here, the Gorin means he's taking away the Vav of Yosef. The Mosifin means he's adding the vav to the word chamishi so to make it chamishi sov, and then darshan, and then he darshans that what it means is chomesh al chomesh. Remember, we're making this out of a whole cloth, right? It doesn't say it anywhere. It doesn't say it. How do we come to say this whole principle? And I know, Michael, you have a problem with it, and the whole principle of a fifth and a fifth, why it should be on one, not on the other. I mean, where does this? It seems to be plucked out of thin air. And the fact of the matter is that the Gemara is telling us the Torah doesn't say it in so many words, but we're going to learn pshat because of the nuance of the letters in the pasuk. That the letters in the pasuk lead us to this. Now it takes the brain of a chazal to be able to figure it out. I mean, you and I were sitting there and say, okay, Yosef, what's the vav? What does it mean? Chazal is telling us that Yosef has an extra dimension to it. And that dimension is that the Torah meant to say, even though it doesn't say it in so many words, it meant to say that you can move the letter around in the pasuk, and Yosef can be used to add to the Chamishi Sov to tell us Chomesh al Gabe Chomesh. Not something we would ever have dreamed up on our own.
Sounds like a dangerous kind of shaky thing.
But
took it upon themselves to move around the letters,
right,
create a darshan from, because with the whole Torah with so many letters, you can create all kinds of things by moving letter around.
Right. Therefore we say that the Chazal had Ruach HaKodesh. They had the wisdom to understand what the pasuk was telling us, and we believe we support that. We say that if Rashi or the Chazal come out and they give us an interpretation, which on its face there is no rhyme or reason to understand it. When we look at the words, there's no reason from the pasuk to say this is what it means.
We don't have that movement of letters in any other place in the Torah. I never heard.
It's very rare. It's very rare. You're right. Where the Torah, where we juxtapose letters from one word to the other.
Is there another example of this?
I'm going to try to find another. Offhand, I didn't come with another example, but I'm going to look to see where there's another example of that, and we'll follow up on that. But it is a principle which the Gemara, which Rashi enunciates and says it's a principle in the Gemara. So again, we're gonna take a look. But again, we're establishing this principle, and we're saying that this is a principle in the Torah. So therefore, we can understand that is what is happening here, and therefore, in other words, the dichotomy here is: do we say because there is the word V'Yosef by Truma and V'Yosef by Kodesh that they're the same, or do we say no, that V'Yosef by Truma is different than the V'Yosef by Hagdish, and by Truma we're going to say that it means Chomesh al Gabe Chomesh, but by Hagdish we're not. That's the subtlety of our discussion. So let's try to see how Rashi tries to postulate this, but this will be the subject of our deeper review next week. But the kasha is, how do we look at Hagdish vis-a-vis Truma? Is there a comparison to Truma, or is there not a comparison to Truma? So says Rashi, Nosan lo asa keren, l'achas shenishba v'hoda, v'nischayev keren v'chomesh v'nishba lo ala chomesh. He swears on the chomesh, right? This is what we talked about. The example that he swears on the chomesh, the kofras chomesh, he denies the chomesh. V'omen asativ loch. I already gave it to you. I put it into your mailbox. V'nishba, and he swears. V'hoda, and then he admits how is a mosiv chomesh al chomesh. Once he admits, the penalty is a chomesh on the chomesh, right? Shekofar, which he denied. V'chein im chaza v'nosel chomesh rishon. And if he returned the first chomesh which he swore, and then he denies again, sheni. Now he denies, he owes him a chomesh and a chomesh, and he says, "I paid you that." So in other words, he's swearing falsely again, right? On the second, right? V'hoda, and then he admits, "Oh yeah, really, I do owe you that second chomesh." Most of chomesh al chomesh sheni v'chein la'olam. In other words, how many times can you do this? But basically he's saying there's no end, just because it's not a shava pruta, which we normally say that you discount everything not worth a shava pruta. The Gemara is telling us here that the shava pruta dimension does not apply here. In other words, just because it's not a shava pruta doesn't mean he gets away with it. That he has to keep paying. All right, it's a small point, but he wants to make a distinction between this and any other case. Achi yashmish a keren, achi dismarte keren, chomesh shehu mischayev kvar, the chomesh which he is chayev, v'chozer v'kofro, kori keren. It's now considered keren. In other words, to your point, Michael, the chomesh now becomes the keren, because you were wondering about, well, we have an original keren. That keren is already out the door because he paid it. So this chomesh becomes a keren. It becomes a principle for which the chomesh on the chomesh is now evaluated. So in other words, we take the word keren and we slide it from the original keren to the chomesh. That's how he's interpreting how we do this. Okay, it's a definitional thing, but he wants to tell us that chomesh becomes a keren. Okay, Gabi.
Rabbi, so we're really, I understand both sides of the argument, and it's a fascinating argument, but it's a question of where Hekdesh ranks between Truma and Maser Sheni, if it's closer there, because
one or the other.
It seems like the line of demarcation is the level of holiness, whether the Chomesh and the Chomesh perpetuates.
Right, exactly right. Gabi Truma, Ochel Truma b'shogeg. If you ate Truma b'shogeg, Ksiv Chamishi so, it says 1/5. The lo mashma ela chad chomesh. With the word chamishi so, the way it's written, only reflects one chomesh. Notwithstanding, it said that it refers to one. It also means a fifth on a fifth. Kagon inasan keren v'chomesh menachulin kimishpato, right? V'nasa hatashlumin truma v'chozav v'ochel also chomesh mishalom also v'chumsha. So in other words, even though on its face it would seem to be one chomesh, we still can learn out that once he stole it from the truma I'm talking about, that there is a second chomesh, right? The echad. Okay, so I think this goes. Okay, so all right, so we'll stop with this Rashi. So okay, so where we're holding now is the question of Hagdish on Kodesh, whether or not we attribute it to Truma, meaning Chomesh on Chomesh, or whether or not we say no, it's more like Maser Sheni, which has no Chomesh on Chomesh, and that's going to be, now we're going to delve into that discussion, what it's more like. But you see, what's interesting, which at least from the standard of the Gemara, is that it's telling us that the Kedusha of Truma is unquestionably at a level where Chomesh of Chomesh applies. So what does that mean? The Kohen has to get his due. And once you start, so to speak, monkeying around, once you start messing around with the Truma, now you're into the slippery slope of having to pay a Chomesh and maybe more than a Chomesh. But with Bedek HaBayis, with Hagdish, which is not to a Kohen, but it's to the Rabbeinu Shalom, because that's the Beis HaMikdash, we have our doubts. In other words, the Rabbeinu Shalom, so to speak, Kaviyachol, is saying the Kedusha of a Kohen, that goes unquestioned. My Kedusha, maybe I'm willing to be I'm willing to back off on my Kedusha. The Rabbeinu Shalom is saying, maybe my Kedusha, it's not so terrible. But that's an interesting point, because on the face of it, if I asked you which is a higher degree of Kedusha, Bedek HaBayis or Truma, I think a lot of people would say Bedek HaBayis, that Hagdish, belonging to the Beis HaMikdash, is the highest calling. Am I right? I mean, I think that's that a lot of people would say.
I would argue that if you gave me.
You would argue that, and I would say that you would not be wrong. But here we see from this Gemara, at least now, we'll get further into it and understand it. But at least from the discussion, it seems that the Kedusha, the honor and the Kedusha to a Kohen can be higher than the Kedusha of the Bedek HaBayis, which is really an interesting approach. And again, next week we'll really get into that a little bit further. But
only for donations.
But what we're seeing here again and again is the intricacies of how we deal with how they dealt at the time with this whole question of it was remember the Kohen had no income. The Kohen only was sustained. The Kohen and Levium were only sustained by the matanos that were giving from Truma and Maser. So clearly, Truma and Maser had a very, very important role. It's like today, I mean, we don't have Kohanim. Everybody's on his own, so we don't give Truma and Maser. But at a point in time where the Kohanim were not self-sustaining, this was a very high calling. Maybe we can understand that the Rebbeinu Shalom says, my shvatim, my Kohanim, my Levium have to be sustained no matter what. I can take a back seat. I can take I have broad shoulders, Kaviyachal, says the Rebbeinu Shalom. The Kohanim Levium, you can't shortchange.
But they also could have also could have invested in real estate to go on them.
They had no real estate. They had no property.
But they could have bought.
No, they were not allowed to. They weren't
allowed to own anything.
No, they could not own anything. They had to be totally at the recipient end of Klal Yisrael. That's the way the Rebbeinu Shalom set it up. And so Rebbeinu Shalom says, I'm protecting my Kohanim and my Levium. No messing around with the Kohanim and Levium. When it comes to me, okay, we'll deal, but not the Kohanim and Levium. I find that really funny.
Rabbi, just one last point, and that is, so this is Truma. We distinguish between Truma, which is for the Kohanim, and they're in need because they don't have income. We understand that. We have Maser Sheni, which is a lower level of holiness.
Because it's only for you. It's only for you.
And then we have Trumas HaMaser, which is for the poor, right? In those years, don't we have a third tithe?
Oh, yeah. But we're not even addressing that.
But that would seem to say that, God would say it's a third tithe, it's a lower level of holiness. It's certainly not going to be the level of Truma. Is he saying, therefore, I'll take care of the poor, you don't have to worry about it?
Yeah, because remember, with the poor, we don't have this whole inyan of redemption. In other words, we are talking about only foods that have to be brought to Yerushalayim. So this whole question of redeeming and using, when it comes to the poor, you give it to them on the spot. There's no.
So this is all about the classification of Kodesh.
Exactly.
It's really
Kodesh,
holiness, and where that goes.
Exactly.
It's
exactly. And Maser Sheni is a lower level of Kodesh than, of course, Truma. And the question is, where does Hagdish fit into the picture? Exactly right.
Thank you, Rabbi.
All right. So Mitzvah Shem, so again, wonderful discussion. And we're seeing how carefully our Chazal have dealt with these issues. And Mitzvah Shem, next week we're gonna probe further to understand where Hegdish fits into the role of Kodesh vis-a-vis the Chomesh and vis-a-vis all the other issues. So a good Rosh Chodesh, and it should be a good week in Shalom Al Yisrael. And Mitzvah Shem, we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah.